which I have been sort of stumbling around in confusion and doubt. And I'll tell you why. Linda and I have gotten into the habit of binging. You all know what binging is?
Yeah.
Not me, could you explain that?
Right.
Movie binging.
Oh.
TV binging.
Yeah.
Oh.
And
Good stuff.
we do this in the evening from between the hours of about 6 and 9. And some of the TV that you can stream these days is really interesting. I find
Yeah.
it. A lot of it's quite good. And this week we spent the week binging on an adaptation of one of Philip K. Dick's novels. I don't know if you know who Philip K. Dick is.
Thrillers?
Well, Philip K. Dick is a guy who died, I think he died in the early 80s. He was sort of a science fiction philosopher, detective story kind of guy. He wrote Blade Runner.
Oh.
He wrote Total Recall. You know, stories like this that have been made into movies. And so Amazon made a series, a 10-part series of one of his novels called The Man in the High Castle. And the premise of this book is that the United States did not win the Second World War. The Axis won the Second World War, Japan and Germany. And Germany occupied the eastern half, or more than half, of the United States. And the Japanese occupied the Pacific states. And in the middle was sort of a no man's land. And as Linda pointed out when they were looking at a map of this division, that land that became the neutral land almost exactly fits the contour of the inland sea that this continent had several million years ago, and which was replaced by the rise of the land due to the subduction of the Pacific plate underneath the North American plate, and raised up the Rocky Mountains. And that turned out to be the neutral part of this new country. But anyway, this was a story that really pulls your brain apart. And you're not really sure what's going on or why it's going on. There are a lot of characters in the story that I'm familiar with, like Reinhold Heydrich. I don't know if you've ever heard that name, but he was one of Hitler's topmost advisors and generals. He was a general in the army who was assassinated in Czechoslovakia about 1942 or 43, and had the reputation of being the most evil man in the world. And he was.
A stone heart.
Yeah, he was a bad guy. But anyway, he shows up in this movie. He was not assassinated. The year is 1960, and it's an enthralling movie because the detail in this movie is astounding. And it really shows what the United States might have looked like and felt like if we had lost the war. And there's even a little bit of Zen in it.
Because the Japanese.
Because one of the Japanese characters, who turns out to be a major influence in the story, is the Minister of Trade for the Pacific states. Well, anyway, that was an extremely weird movie. I totally recommend it. It was a lot of fun. And you don't get the answer until the last 3 seconds.
Oh.
Oh, 1 second.
I don't know, Daishin, I think Mr. Holmes was more our speed.
Mr. Holmes is a good movie. Mr. Holmes is a good movie, and there's an article in the newspaper this morning about the
The
controversy surrounding that movie. It's kind of a shame.
Well, it's just about the ownership.
Yeah, I think it was
It's sort of, you know,
petty.
it's heartbreaking to think, you know, that a character like that, which has become so much a part of my youth, and I continue to be interested in it, and it continues to flourish in this culture, is a commodity.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Well, another thing that set my wheels turning this week was that I've been reading a book. It's called Spooky Action at a Distance. And this is a book on physics,
So it's quantum.
which is an attempt to describe and discuss some of the things that are happening and being discovered in quantum theory that are completely at odds with the way that we normally view the world. Very much similar to the man in the high castle in a way.
Mm.
Except this is much more fundamental and basic, because what is being suggested here is that there may not be any such thing that we call location, and there may not be anything that we call distance. That these are ways of looking at the world that may not be veridical, that may not correspond in any way to the truth, or what we would like to think of as the truth. And then I also, at the same time, I delved into an article on evolution that I found online, which was all about what is called the interface theory of perception.
Interfaith?
Interface theory of perception. Of perception. It's an idea that a psychological evolutionist came up with by the name of Donald Hoffman. And his theory, which I find very intriguing, is that perception, the way we perceive this world, and all the things that I've been talking about have been about how we perceive this world, can be traced to a means of supporting us, and
A means of what?
supporting us, a means of acquiring food, and a means of facilitating reproduction.
Sure.
And that the way we look at the world may not, once again, have anything to do with the truth.
Gee, they seem to be catching up with the Buddha.
It's an interesting idea.
Well, it's a pretty old idea.
Well,
2,500 years.
not to the extent that we all see the world, all the species on this planet see the world differently, in very different ways. We know that dogs have eyes that are different from ours, and cats, and some animals have color perception, and some animals have 8, 16 eyes, and that sort of thing.
Mollusks.
And all of this, all of these differences can be attributed to the way in which they support themselves. But once again, the fact that we rely upon location and distance may have everything to do with how we evolved rather than how it actually is out here. It may not be that way at all. And finally, and this is the thing I really want to talk about this morning, I got myself, there are a couple of students, and you know who you are, who are involved in studying the precepts and working the precepts as koans. And in delving into these koans, I think I've now gone through the koan precepts like at least 4 or 5 times, including when I went through them with Roshi as a student. And I have to say that as a student, you know, you don't really learn anything as a student. At least I didn't. I mean, it was only after I became a teacher that I started to really, you know, start to figure this out a little bit. And I have found that to be the case with the koan precepts. The koan precepts are unusual precepts. The various collections that we study all can be described as various encounter koans. An encounter between people having a conversation, or, you know, hitting each other with sticks, or doing all the various things that occur in many of these koans. The precept koans are more like questions. In fact, many of them are questions. And that makes them very different from the way that we usually work a koan. The precautions that is given prior to doing the precept koans is to try to show the real thing. But that's not always possible. I mean, sometimes you have to say something. The less the better, but it certainly is an aid to presenting whatever it is you have to say. And you know, I thought that I would read to you the first half dozen of these koans, so that you get an idea as to what I'm trying to explain. The first koan is, what is the Dharma? And it says in parentheses, demonstrate the real thing. The second one is, what is Prajna? 3, what is liberation? 4, are these something acquired after practice or something with which we are endowed? 5, why do we say obtain liberation or become Dharmakaya? And finally, what are the 3? Now, as you can tell, these are not easy questions to answer in any form.
Especially if there's in a koan.
But I have found them to be they have led me, subsequent to my time as a student, to some of my most profound insights into this practice. Why do we say obtain liberation or become Dharmakaya? When I first started Zen practice, I assumed that I was here for a reason. That I went through the pain and discomfort of learning how to sit because I wanted to become awakened in some sense. I wasn't very sure as to what exactly that meant, and I certainly was not positive that this was a path that would lead me to it, but I wanted to have the experience of a practice like this. And so for most of the time that I have been practicing Zen, I have done so in the service of becoming awakened, of, as it says in this koan, obtaining liberation or becoming Dharmakaya. It was my assumption that if I did something, something else would result. That if I sat on my cushion long enough, that eventually I would become awake. That's a form of linear thought. That is a form of thinking about cause and effect. And it wasn't until I had been practicing for many years that it finally occurred to me, even though I had been told this many times, it finally occurred to me, I finally understood that this practice is not a linear practice. We don't recognize cause and effect. And this particular question that occurs so early in the precepts is a warm-up to the koans, or the questions that are going to come later concerning the pure precepts and the other two of the three treasures. The easiest way to say this is to say that in Zen practice, there is only one tense that we use in our language, or we should use in our language. And that tense is the present perfect tense. It's not about the past. It's not about the future. It's about right now. And everything occurs right now. I'm already liberated. I wasn't sitting, it turns out, to become awakened or liberated or become the Dharmakaya. I was sitting because I'm already awakened and part of the Dharmakaya. I'm already enlightened. You see? That's a very important realization. Now, of course, here's where it gets tricky. Because it is the case that I didn't know that before. So what are we talking about here? I'm already awakened. But I didn't know that 10 years ago. That's what makes this practice so wonderful. Because it is also the case that when you're at the beginning of this practice, you're also at the end of this practice. The beginning and the end are part of the present perfect tense. And it's all right here now. One of the things I had to do fairly early in my practice was build this Zendo. You know, this room started out as my sitting room, my meditation room. Except that it kept getting bigger. And which I was totally happy about. And I even I had to redesign some things to get rid of some obstructions and some things so that the room would be bigger and more spacious. And even before it was finished, it was almost finished, we had an eye-opening ceremony. And a number of people came to the eye-opening ceremony. Bernie was here. Joan Halifax was here. Jitsudo was here, of course, because he did the eye-opening ceremony. There were a number of people here. Can you remember who else was here?
Well, you're here.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, of course.
I don't remember who all was here, but a lot of people.
But this room was full. This room was packed. And I can remember being in sort of a panic because the night before, because I didn't have a name for this place. I didn't know what to call this place. And I had to have a name, right? So, I don't know how I hit upon the name of Prajna. And I told Jitsudo that I was going to name it Prajna Zendo. And he didn't think that was a good idea. And
Did he have a name?
no,
He just didn't think it was a good
he wasn't particularly in favor of that name. And you know, I wasn't particularly in favor of the name.
Yeah, I remember that.
You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
But the fact of the matter is that I didn't have any time to dilly-dally about this thing. And so I just came, you know, Prajna became the name. I'm so glad that it did. You know? I mean, it's not like I knew what Prajna was.
But you did.
Sounded good.
Yeah, it sounded, you know.
You broke precedents. It didn't have the word mountain. Yeah.
Well, that's true.
It could have
That's
been
true.
flat mountain or.
Well, this is not a mountain here, but we can see some. Took me a long time to figure out what Prajna was. I always had a problem with that word because, of course, we have it translates as wisdom into English. And, of course, we use that word. That's a very common word in our language and has been so for hundreds of years, right? And I always associated wisdom with a plaque that my grandmother had on her kitchen wall that was situated right across from the dining table in front of my grandfather. so that he got to look at this thing every day of his life. And the plaque said, it was one of those carved wooden plaques that you buy at, Klein's Corners, for example. I'm sure they've got this plaque down here. And the plaque said, "Kissin' don't last, cookin' do."
It said what?
Kissin' don't last, cookin' do.
No.
Now, I thought that was what wisdom was. That's the kind of oaky wisdom that I had been raised with, right?
Pretty basic.
Not bad, actually.
Not bad at all.
No, I grew up believing that too.
Let's put one up here.
Right on the front of the altar.
Yeah.
I'll be passing through Klein's Corners, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
Well, I always thought that Prajna had something to do with wisdom like that. Turns out it doesn't really.
It could.
Well, it does.
Yeah.
It does. I mean, it could be included within the definition of Prajna, I suppose. But Prajna turned out to be much simpler than that, actually. I'm starting to sweat in here because I'm hot. That's Prajna.
You want a tissue? Or are you just giving an example?
I'm giving an example of what Prajna is.
Mm-hmm.
See that candle on the altar?
It's burning.
That flame is Prajna. That's what that candle does. That is the function of that candle. Prajna is about function. It's about functioning. And Prajna is and has to do directly with what we call Maha, or the one body, big mind, the whole shebang. It is the functioning of big mind. That's what Prajna is. And Manjushri carries a sword around, though this one doesn't, but usually Manjushri carries a sword around, so that he can cut away all dualities, like good and bad, right and wrong, all those things. So that enables Bernie Roshi, who was raised as an Orthodox Jew, to say in one of his books that the Nazi soldier throwing a baby into the oven in Auschwitz is an example of Prajna.
I don't like Prajna anymore.
Now, come on, Dan. So Prajna has no, it has no content.
It's also not very likable.
Pardon?
It's not likable, that's not one of the characteristics of Prajna.
That's right, that's right,
To be likable.
that's right.
It's kind of irrelevant whether you like it or not.
The other interesting thing about Prajna is that Manjushri, who is the bodhisattva that represents this word, is a kid. He's a teenager. He's most commonly portrayed as a teenager. And he's a rather emotional, acting out sort of guy. Reb Anderson wrote a book many years ago, talking about the different bodhisattvas, and he, at the end of each chapter, or every bodhisattva that he discussed, he had a section where he tried to find modern representatives of that bodhisattva, people who might be said to represent that bodhisattva. And for Manjushri, his favorite modern representative was Bob Dylan, which I find rather interesting. So I've spent the week dealing with things that are not what they seem to be. And that actually is the reason I came to this practice. That's what keeps me in this practice. I am continuously surprised and beguiled by this practice. And I thank you all for practicing with me.